QSO Today, episode 467, Kyle Krieg AA0Z. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Since our last episode 2 weeks ago, the following people have become QSO Today listener sponsors. We thank them for their support of the QSO Today project. John Camola, W8EWL, $10 monthly sponsor. Lynn DeHart, KB3FN, $10 monthly sponsor. John Zeitlow, K9WIC, $100 yearly sponsor. Jason Wills, K04DDG, $10 monthly sponsor. Yevgeny Boguslavsky, VE3KOT, $10 monthly sponsor. Gary Tibbetts, AE1TG, $100 yearly sponsor. Donald Gover, KC9ZMY, $100 yearly sponsor. And John Janitatos, KD2LFN, $100 yearly sponsor. The QSO Today project is the new language as the QSO Today listener sponsors also become full QSO Today Academy members for the duration of their sponsorship with full access to all QSO Today Academy resources, including our community forums, Academy presentations, all past QSO Today podcasts, and the video library of over 500 QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations, all combined neatly in our new online forum system. There were other listener sponsors who wished to remain anonymous, and we thank them for supporting the QSO Today project. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Academy event last weekend was a success, with almost 1,000 hams coming to enjoy the 25 great presentations and discussions that followed. Our lounge was a bit light, and after some discussion with Michelle, W5NYV, and Anthony, K8ZT, we determined that the Academy has the infrastructure to do more monthly and smaller events for its members, but that I need to work on an easier access and movement through the Academy's social areas to the presentations and back. Our new SQL.io platform gives us a lot of opportunities to make these adjustments because it is embedded in the software that me, Vlad, and now Ken are integrating to make the great online academy to learn amateur radio. Stay tuned. The rumors that QSO Today has had a falling out with the ARRL is just that, rumors. I am an ARRL Diamond Club member and an advocate that every ham radio operator belong to the ARRL for its role in the area of spectrum defense and support of the IARU, the International Amateur Radio Union in Geneva, Switzerland. Representatives of the ARRL may perceive that the QSO Today Academy is a competitor learning center. Just as anyone who writes a book about ham radio not published by the ARRL is a competitor to their book business. In my opinion, this is small thinking, especially when we need to band together to bring new and younger hams into the hobby. As a ham for 50 years now, these kinds of perceptions are not new, and in the long run will hurt our efforts. We stand together for success or fall separately apart. I urge the ARRL, its leadership, its board of directors, and its membership to reconsider its opinions. There, I said it, in my first QSO Today podcast editorial. If you have comments, please click on the new QSO Today Community Forum link and join the conversation in a respectful manner. Kyle Krieg AA07 says that radio, in this case CB radio, was the pre-internet social network that he used with his friends in his Midwest rural town. Imagine American Graffiti with radios. Eventually, learning that amateur radio can take Kyle to a higher level, AA0Z jumped in completely, immersing himself in POTA, Parks on the Air, portable operation, software-defined radio, and remote control stations. We both agree that ham radio contesting should be even more gamified, and we discuss all of these topics in this QSO Today. AA0Z, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Kyle?
I'm here, 4Z1UG. This is Alpha Alpha Zero Zulu. You're 5'9 plus, St. Louis, Missouri, United States.
And you're loud and clear in Efrat, Israel. In my sequel circle, that anybody that went to the Academy this last weekend has had a chance to see how they work. Anyway, Kyle, it's great to have you on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Yeah, so my ham radio story started back in high school, back in the late 90s and late 80s and early 90s. I ran around with a group of friends, and we had CBs in our cars and trucks. And that was our original social media. That's how we got a hold of one another, on the weekends and whenever we were driving around town. And I forgot who actually put a CB in their car first. I think it was my friend Chris, because he had the SWR meter. And I remember setting up at a local spot that we all hung out at, and we were, trying to get our SWR the lowest. We had no idea what SWR was, but we knew that it had to be the lowest to propagate out. As a sophomore and junior in high school, I had no idea about antennas. I had no clue on what SWR was, had no idea on ground planes and any of that.
What was the hometown?
Troy, Missouri. It's about an hour and a half north of St. Louis.
An hour and a half north of St. Louis.
Yeah.
It's rural mid-America.
Yeah, little farming community, right. At the time, there was about 3,000 people in Troy, and the high school was about 1,000 kids. So you can imagine what the weekends was like.
You must have had a main drag in your town, and that's where you drove up and down the boulevard?
Exactly. You nailed it.
We had Whittier Boulevard in Southern California.
Yeah, and we would drive up and down the drag, and we would have specific channels that we would get on to call each other. We also we played games. We'd play hide and go seek on the CB in high school. And that was, the things that we did. And that was our original social media, right? That's how we got online.
Pre-cell phone for the most part.
Pre-cell phone. Yep. I remember getting a first cell phone that was only used for emergencies. And it was, this big honking thing that you plugged in the cigarette lighter.
A bag phone.
Yeah, it was a bag phone. Right. So that morphed. So I graduated high school, and then that morphed into me going to college.
Did you have an interest in electronics, or the radio was a social thing?
The radio was a social thing. No interest in electronics. Didn't grow up with a background in electronics. None of my parents were techie, and we didn't have like an electronics class in high school. The CBs were mainly used for social interaction and just something to do, and something cool to have in your car, your truck, other than the 6x9s that you were trying to blow out, with blasted music at horrible decibels.
So you were kind of like the Stranger Things kids.
We were like, yeah. I mean, if there was like a robotics club back then, we were gonna be the kids in the robotics club. We were definitely on not the cutting edge, but if you got a CB or anything that was associated with that type of communication, you always met us up at the Kroger parking lot about 6 p.m. on a Friday night, and we got your CB installed. We were like the roving mobile installation CB installers in high school.
When we first connected, you met my young protege, Akiva, who's learning electronics from me, and you mentioned that you were a musician from the early years. Were you part of a band? Did you have band equipment, amplifiers, all that stuff? So you had some electronic knowledge?
Yeah, my friend group, they were all guitar players, and my parents made me take piano lessons whenever I was 5 years old, and I think I quit sometime in high school. And I was always kind of the outcast of my friend group whenever we would get together and play, because one, I hated piano lessons. My parents kind of forced them on me, and I absolutely hated practicing the piano. I'm kicking myself because of that, because I'm not a very good piano player, and I've been playing for years and years and years. But they would bring their guitars and they would bring their amplifiers, and I had nothing. I had an acoustical piano as a kid, and electronic pianos at the time were thousands and thousands of dollars. So they would invite me over and say, hey, we're going to, play a few songs. And plus, I was raised with classical music, and my piano teacher was pretty strict and didn't let me branch out. So I knew no songs on the radio, and they would be strumming along with songs that, were playing on the radio. And I would go over there, and even if we went to a place that had a piano, I would sit down and I would, play something by Bach or a Clementi or, something like that. And they would be like, oh, this kid, he's not for us.
Yeah, it's hard to sing with Rachmaninoff for some reason.
Right. I mean, I knew plenty of like sonatinas and, some other things that I was playing, but I went over there a couple times, was never invited back. But they were more into guitars and amplifiers, and I didn't know any of that stuff. All I know that, they would crank their amplifiers till 11, and it would just, I'd be like, oh, I don't have an amplifier. I've got an acoustical piano.
So when you left high school, what happened after that? Did you go to college?
Yeah, went to college. I went to a small school starting out in Northeast Missouri State University, because I didn't want to go to a big university my first couple of years. So I went up to Northeast Missouri State, which is in Kirksville, Missouri. It's about 3 hours away from my hometown. And there, I cannot remember why I went this route, but, I was with being big into CB communication in high school. At some point during my sophomore year in college, I decided I was going to get my ham radio license. And I cannot for the life of me remember how I came to that point. But I knew that, it was the next progression, the next step. But I can't remember what motivated me to get my license. I can't remember if it was, MCOM related. I wanted to have some type of communication path. I don't know how I learned about it, but all I remember is I went and I bought a Gordon West book at some bookstore. I mean, Amazon was not around. It was probably had to have been Barnes and Noble or somehow I got a Gordon West study guide, a technician study guide. In that process, I also discovered that you did not have to learn the code, Morse code, to get a technician's license. So that motivated me even more. And I studied and I studied and I studied in my dorm room. And I basically, because I had no electronics background, I studied the questions and the answers. And I can't remember how I figured out that there was an amateur radio club in Kirksville, but somehow I did. And I went on a Saturday morning in March of 95, and I took my ham radio test and passed. And about, a week and a half or 2 weeks later, here comes my call sign, Kilo Bravo 0 Romeo Papa Mike was my first call sign. And I didn't have any money. I had $0. And I said, all right, I had this call sign, but I didn't know what to do with it. I knew that, I wanted this and this was something I wanted to do, but I didn't have any plans with it. I came home that summer and I worked at a book manufacturing company in my hometown, and I saved some dollars and I bought my first radio at the end of the summer. And that was a Kenwood V71A, I believe. And like my CB in my truck, which I had kept during college, I mounted it right next to my CB and put my antenna up. And lo and behold, then, the world opened up to me on the local repeaters, and did some research on, all right, what repeaters were local to me? How could I get into them? Learned about PL tones and CTCSS and all these things that were not in the CB realm, and started playing around.
Now, did you find a club or anybody? I find that so interesting that, you get this license, but did it occur to you that there actually were ham radio clubs?
No.
Isn't that interesting?
I had no idea that there were clubs out there that was the main focus. After I had gotten my license, the Kirksville Amateur Radio Club had invited me to their club meeting. And I remember going once, and it was boring, right? They talked about club stuff.
They had to open with a treasurer's report.
Right.
It's a killer, I think.
Right. I was 19, 20 years old. I roll up into the VFW hall, and I saw all the antennas and was excited about all the antennas. I'm like, oh, that's cool, right? And I get into the club. No one said hello to me. I sat in the back. They probably thought that I was lost, and they started in with the treasurer's report and the secretary's reports, and what DX they were working that week, and there was no presentation, and I was by far the youngest person there, and it was not a big group. And I remember walking out of that club meeting and saying, this is not for me.
Oh, interesting. You know what? I had a similar experience this year. I'm going into a club. I won't say which club. I've gone to several, but I find it so interesting that a stranger can walk into an amateur radio club meeting and nobody says anything.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well, how badly do we want new blood? Well, maybe we don't want new blood.
Right.
So what happened after that? You've got this technician class license. Now, if I look on your QRZ page, you're obviously operating a lot of traditional but non-traditional modes. It appears to me that you're now a CW operator. That's pretty clear.
Yes.
What happened after that to kind of move you along so that you're now have such a heavy focus and interest in ham radio?
Yeah, so I switched schools. I transferred down to the University of Missouri, which is in Columbia, Mizzou, and I got involved with the solar car. The solar car, if you don't know anything about the solar car...
I remember there's a solar car race.
Yes. Colleges, basically, they have teams, technical colleges have teams where they build a solar car, and they get funding from different companies, and they build a car out of carbon fiber and solar panels and, drives and wheels and axles, and they put it all together, and then you race them across the United States. And I gravitated towards the solar car and was on that team. And I remember, again, my memory fails me, but we had a professor that I believe his best friend was a ham radio operator. And they were talking about the telemetry and the communications with the lead car and the chase car and home base and all that other stuff. And he came to us and said, I think we should, his name was Dr. Wheelove, and he was very, very brainy. Like, you could put in an equation on the board, and we would be sitting there trying to work this equation for 20 minutes, and he would already have the answer in his head, before we even got the equation mapped out. And Dr. Wheelove said, I think we should use ham radio for our communications. And I piped up, and I'm like, I already have a license. I'm already one step ahead of you. So I helped get some of the crew licensed to ham radio and basically talked it up and said, oh, yeah, you can, use 100 and, 50 watts, 100 watts. We buy these mobile radios. We can put them in our chase car. We could, you get a call sign, the telemetry, as long as it's not encrypted, we could use the 2 meters or 4, APRS or something, to send telemetry back. Yeah, it's awesome. So a bunch of us, or my friends in the solar car team, they got licensed, and we started working on the telemetry and getting radios and putting them in the chase cars. And we went on Sun Race. That's the big race that they have every 2 years. And unfortunately, I was not able to go on Sun Race because I had a previous commitment. It's during the summer, of course, and I had a previous commitment. But the ham radio stuff worked out, and they were like, "This is great." Then what I hear was Cal Poly and MIT and Purdue, all of those schools learned that Mizzou was using amateur radio for their communications, and then guess what? The next 2 years, they were all using amateur radio.
So you're a trendsetter. You didn't realize that you had an effect on a national race.
Yeah, we had no idea, but they were like, "Oh, we had no idea," because I believe that they rented radios from Motorola, and they paid a license to get these radios, and they're like, "Wait a minute, amateur radio is free, and you can do all these things?"
How interesting.
Yeah. So after we did that for a couple of years, and then I fell out of the solar car because I just had schoolwork and whatnot. And after college, I graduated and I got an adult job in St. Louis, and I really put amateur radio on the back burner for a while. I really didn't do anything with it from age 25 until about 35. But I always had my license. I always renewed my license, and my license was up for renewal, and I renewed it because I knew that it was something that I wanted to do long term, and it was a good investment, right? I knew that I had learned about the MCOM stuff. I wasn't an ARRL member because at the time it wasn't that big of a deal to me. But I remember going to the library in college and reading articles in QST and learning about the hobby. So back whenever I turned, sometime in my early to mid 30s, I got back into it and decided, you know what, I'm going to get my general. So I studied for my general and passed that, and got a new call sign, November 0 Kilo Tango Kilo, my initials, and started back into ham radio doing general HF. I learned about the world of HF, and the world opens up to you whenever you start doing HF.
And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. That includes the upcoming QSO Today Academy event on September 9th and 10th, 2023. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time, even after the event, and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A. And additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. What was the trigger for HF when you got back into it? I mean, again, it doesn't sound to me like you were a club guy.
Right. I think that I'm a big motivator of I want to do the next step. And I was looking for another hobby. And, I had the amateur radio background and had the license, had the technician. And I can't remember, again, my memory fails me on what was the trigger that got me into HF. And I was not big into clubs. Like I had never gone to a club meeting back in my hometown. I had never gone to a club meeting, or I had gone to a club meeting at Mizzou. They had a amateur radio club there, but I never went to any of the meetings. And they had a repeater. So I think it was just a natural progression. Oh, I need to get my general, right? And then at the time, I can't remember if they had advanced and then extra, but I said, all right, I need to get to the next step. This is my next journey. I need to get to general in my amateur radio career. And then after I got my general, I'm like, oh, the next step is to get an HF radio. So I had gotten, again, saved up and got a Kenwood 2000, and that was my first HF radio, and put a small dipole outside of my apartment and tuned in the world. And at that point, it was game over. I was like, this is awesome. What do you mean I'm listening to signals around the world? This is great. So it was just a natural progression that I went through.
That's pretty amazing. And what did you start doing? Voice first? Did that seem like that was the natural?
Yeah.
And how did that go? For example, I found on HF that voice is boring for the most part. That's why CW seems so interesting to me.
Yeah. At the time, it was the only mode that I knew. The unit came with a microphone, right? And I was so used to the CB ways and the 2 meter and 440 way of communicating FM. So naturally, I had the microphone, and early days, I had tuned a dipole to 20 meters, and I remember, I was probably transmitting on 40 and 80, and had no idea that I needed to tune this antenna. Like I was just I was just talking. I was having a good time, and I wasn't logging any contacts. I was just throwing my call sign out whenever people were calling CQ, and having a small QSO with them and saying, oh, that was cool. I just talked to California, or I just talked to Maine or whatnot. And, knew about the privileges, right? I was in the general portion, but really didn't know much about antennas and feed line and how all that stuff went together. I just threw it up to a point where I'm like, okay, I can hear signals. I'm just going to key up. And I just went. Then whenever I started reading more about QST, at that time I had joined the ARL and I was getting QST. And I had more knowledge about, there's a whole there's a whole ecosphere out there of people, of like-minded people that are even in the St. Louis area that I can ask to help. And then that's whenever I started going to club meetings and associating myself with people that Elmers, that I then went to that club meeting and asked them a bunch of questions about, how do I do this? Or how do I do that?
So what changed then? Was it the conversations on the local repeater that you actually knew the people that you were going to meet at the club meeting?
Yeah.
And so therefore they were expecting you and you were expecting them?
Yeah. Forming that relationship was key, right? I would go to the club meeting, and like your experience, I went to a couple of club meetings here in the St. Louis area, and nobody said hello. I sat in the back. Nobody acknowledged me. And the club meeting was done, and everyone left. And I was like, I've got some questions here. How do I? And I should have raised my hand and said, hey, I'm Kyle. I'm new. Can I ask some questions about, HF and dipoles and verticals and whatnot? But I didn't, because I was a little scared at the time. But after I had thrown my call sign out, I had a corporate job. I had the 2 meter and the 440 radio in the truck, and I would, my commute was 30 minutes, and I would throw my call sign out of, on the repeater, and we would have conversations. And sometimes I would get my questions answered on the repeater, and just by, hey, Mark, just a quick question. That 20 meter dipole that I have, that's 5 feet off the ground, and then he would, go into this dissertation. Oh, it's way too low, but I would form those bonds on the repeater, and then I would go to the club meeting and say, oh, Mark, Kyle, hey, I just talked to you on the repeater coming in. Oh, yeah. And then I would ask those questions, and that's basically how I got my information. But that was very sporadic too. It wasn't like I was going to club meetings every month. It was like, once every 4 or 5 months that I would go to a club meeting. But I was still getting QST because I was still an ARL member, and I would learn about Amoxon, or I'd learn about some type of new antenna that was in QST, and I would go out to the local hardware store and I would try and build it.
And how did it go?
Well, there was a lot of failures, Eric.
That's the best way to learn, I think, is to try something, put some skin in the game. Well, I've got blood in every project that I've ever done. Oh, yeah.
Every successful project and every failed project ends with, I had no idea that was going to happen, right? I am blown away that I didn't let the magic smoke out of my radio for all the times that I had keyed up whenever I wasn't supposed to key up, or antennas that worked, that I would go out and find out that the radiator had been disconnected for months, and I was just, transmitting into empty coax. I mean, I was a young pup and had no idea what I was doing, but I learned a ton.
I think that's the way to learn. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking that, where did I learn my stuff? And I realized that it was listening to conversations on 2 meters. I was a builder. I had my workbench. So as I'm working on projects on my workbench, I'm listening to 2 meters, and I'm occasionally talking. And that's how I became attached to the group around me, the local guys that were doing ham radio, who became my mentors. So we kind of like often diss people who have the new license, that they go out and buy the Baofeng radio, or they buy the 2 meter radio. But on the one hand, that's actually a pretty good way to come up with a number of live human beings in close proximity that can help you with the ham radio project.
Yeah, it's a gateway, right? As long as you get your foot in the door, right? I don't care if it's a Baofeng, I don't care if it's, a TYT, a hand-me-down radio that only transmits on 10 meters. As long as you get the foot in the door and say, oh, there's somebody out there that has like interests like me and can help me out, and there's a whole world out there. That's what it's all about, right?
I think so. What is it you're operating now? Because if I look on your QRZ page, you actually have a live log. I should do an Academy thing on how to put live logs on QRZ.
Yeah.
It looks like you have to be a HTML coder or something similar. It's cool.
Yeah.
But what is it that you're doing now? What kind of rig are you doing it on? I mean, I've got some notes here to ask you, but I think that the way this is going is that you'll probably talk about what excites Kyle right now.
Yeah. So after I got the HF bug, played around with HF for a while, and then I got big into contesting. I learned about, I turned the radio on during the weekend and said, oh, there are a ton of stations on 10 meters. And at the time I was living in an apartment and I had this old Kenwood radio, and it finally had given out, and I had a corporate job. So I did a bunch of research and saved a bunch of money, and I got the thing that a new HF operator should never get. I got a QRP radio. I got a KX3.
Yeah.
And I went out, and it was the 10-meter ARL 10-meter contest. And I went out to the local park and put up a vertical and called CQ on 10 meters and worked the world on 5 watts on my KX3. And that got me hooked into contesting. I was like, oh, this is cool. This is awesome. It was rapid pace. It was quick QSOs. I could submit a log and, in a couple of months, find out my score, how I did with my competitors. So that really solidified my interest in ham radio.
Why the park? I'm curious. Is it because you had a restriction in your apartment building?
No, because the noise floor was like 40 over.
So you knew that it would be better away from the buildings.
Yeah, I had learned through my mentors on, I'm like, I can't hear anything on 40 meters. And they're like, oh, you've got an S40 noise floor. And I'm like, yeah, I do. How did you know? They're like, oh, well, that comes with experience, boy. So they're like, you got to get out. You got to, do you like to work portable? I'm like, oh, I love the outdoors. I love to go hiking and be outside and whatnot. And they're like, oh, well, you need a portable radio and you need to set up outside.
Hence the KX3.
Because at the time, the KX3 was, it still is a modular design, right? So you can buy the amplifier. And if you want a bigger amplifier, you can buy that, later. But I said, you know what? Let me start with the KX3 and let me see how that plays. And then if I want the 100-watt amplifier, I can get that later, right? And I was living in an apartment, and I didn't have a lot of space, and I had this horrible 20-meter antenna. And, after some mentoring, they said, oh, yeah, get yourself a vertical and, go out and get, I think it was, I forgot what the vertical was. But, actually, no, I take that back. It was an NFED. They had told me about an NFED. And I had bought an NFED from a company online, and I had bought the Elecraft online and built it. And I went out and threw the line in the tree, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and I worked the world on 10 meters. And I was hooked. I'm like, oh, this is cool. This is awesome.
So then you have to go out and you have to kind of build a package.
Right.
It's exhausting to go out the first time, and you're trying to figure out how am I going to power this, and you've got the cigarette lighter from the car or the big clips on the car battery.
Yep. So you put together the package on, all right, now I want to operate longer, and how do I get a better antenna, and how do I hear more stations? So here I am going down the rabbit hole.
And there's sun.
Yes.
Right, and there's food and water that you have to consider, right?
Right. I mean, it's a whole thing.
I saw on your QRZ page, you practically take a circus tent out there.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll get into my my QSO party exclamates, but the yeah. So I was big into contesting, and so then I bought an 891, an FT 891, and we went out to, I convinced a friend from high school, Justin, who is now W0JSG. He and he was not licensed at the time. We went out and participated in the Illinois QSO party on a 2-county line. And we set up shop right on the Mississippi River and called CQ and had a blast. We actually won 2-county line that year, and we just had a great time. And the noise floor, because we were set up next to the river. I think we were next to a pumping station, and we had an S9 of noise, but we didn't care. We called CQ, right? And that solidified his interest in amateur radio, and he went out and got his amateur radio license. So Justin and I have been doing Illinois and Missouri QSO Party together for, a long time. And at that time, I said, you know what? I need a base station. I need a better base station. So Flex had just come out with their 6,000 series. And I said, you know what? I'm going to put some money down and I'm going to buy a decent base station. And at the time I had moved into a house and I'm like, I'm going to get, a better radio than a KX3 that had 5 watts at the time, maybe even 10. And I'm going to get a better station. So I invested some money into the Flex and put up a dipole and an end fed at my house here. And again, I live in the city of St. Louis, and the noise level was an S9, right? You really can't hear anything. But I did work, a bunch of stations on my Flex. But the real way that I like to operate was I like to go out portable and set up these huge stations for Missouri QSO Party and Illinois QSO Party and invite all my friends that I had made throughout the years to operate. And Eric, some of the stations that we put up for Missouri QSO Party, I mean, 300 and 400 person clubs don't put up these many antennas. I mean, we would put up 10 antennas and have 5 to 7 people operate at the same time. We would be out in the middle of nowhere. We'd be on a 3-county line. The nearest power line was 3 miles away. The nearest Walmart was an hour and a half or an hour away. And we would just go out in the middle of nowhere and just operate and just kill it.
Now, would you invite also non-ham friends? Do you think that installation out there is a way to attract people into ham radio? People think ham radio is dead if they come out and see your party. Obviously, that's not the case.
Yeah, it was hard to get my non-ham friends out that far to take a look at what we were doing. But there were plenty of instances whenever I was living in St. Louis or in the city, that I would go out to a park I would have a group of friends that we would go hiking with, and I would pack my KX3 and I would pull my KX3 out and operate in a park. Before Parks on the Air was a thing, before National Parks on the Air was a thing, I would go out, we'd go up to a ridgetop, I'd throw an end fed in the trees and, make a few contacts, and there'd be, oh, that's cool. But none of them really gravitated towards having an interest. You can tell whenever somebody's really interested in radio because they start to ask questions, right? On, oh, wow, that was Maine. That was, what are these frequencies that you're using? Why are they calling CQ? Why does that sound like, something from Star Wars?
Right.
And you could tell that the wheels were turning, and there was a lot of friends that I would take out and they would be like, oh, that's cool. And then they would just, not pursue it or not ask any questions. And there's others that would be like, oh, tell me more. But at the time, whenever I was younger, in my early 30s, late 30s, promoting the hobby and, not having the awareness of, hey, this is something cool that we need to promote was not in the foreground of my mind,
You're just trying at that point to kind of be a ham yourself.
Yeah, I was just having fun, right? I mean, if you wanted to get your license, that was great. If not, okay, no big deal.
So you've got some great pictures of POTA. Obviously, this kind of led to POTA. Let's talk a little bit about what are you doing in POTA and what are the possibilities there for someone who's listening right now who's not doing Parks on the Air or something similar to that.
Yeah, POTA is great. POTA is a great program to get outdoors, for you to become the DX, for you to run a pileup. I mean, there's 2 facets of this. There's the activators and then there's the hunters, right? And if you want a thrill, you go out and activate. If you want to search and pounce and, contact stations who are activating, you become a hunter, and you can become both. That's, I'm a hunter and an activator. But what really solidified this was the National Parks on the Air program. And we have a couple of parks here in the St. Louis area. We have the Grant Historical Location and then the Gateway Arch, and that's a national park. A lot of my fascination with ham radio comes with planning and setting up stations and figuring out where the antenna is going to go and what antenna am I going to use and how am I going to get the coax and what type of coax do I need and where's the operating position and, all of the things that come along with it. So whenever I was contacted by Scott in D9E about, hey, we've got some parks here in the St. Louis area. Do you want to help me go activate them? I was like, of course I do. This is right up my alley on planning, getting permits and planning and trying to figure out how we're going to do this. And the operating is the other part. So we had planned to activate the park, the arch. And, there was a whole thing that you had to do, permits and insurance, and you had to go through. You couldn't connect anything. You couldn't put anything in the ground. You couldn't connect anything to any trees. Everything was freestanding. We had to have basically this barricade because the arch was under construction at the time. So it was a whole thing.
That's the orange snow fence.
Yeah. If you take a look at my QRZ page, you'll see the orange fence because the Rangers didn't want the public getting into our antenna system and being close to our antenna system, which we agreed. We wanted to keep the public out, but we wanted to showcase what we were doing. And I remember that operating event, we had a ton of people coming over and asking us what we were doing. And, we had somebody that was not on the radio. We had a 30-second elevator speech that they were talking about ham radio. And we did that early in the year. And I thought that was really cool. I had heard about the National Parks on the Air event, but I just didn't think anything of it. I was just like, oh, it's just another event, right? And I'm not into big awards. I've worked all states. I probably have, I don't know how many countries underneath my belt, but a lot of them are not confirmed because I send QSL cards out, but I'm just not a big rewards guy. I just never been into the awards. And we had activated the arch and we activated the other POTA, the Grant House in St. Louis. And I remember going out to Colorado too that year, and I activated a bunch of parks in Colorado. And after the program was done, okay, it was done. I was, that part of amateur radio is done. But then I remember hearing about Parks on the Air. And at first, I wasn't that big into it, didn't think that much of it, right? But then they had created the website and they had shown all of the parks that were, near me. And not only were there, the two national parks, but there were a whole slew of other parks that were close to me that I had no idea that were in the system. And of course, they're not national parks, they're state parks and conservation areas and wildlife areas. So along with contesting and getting on during the weekend, I'm like, oh, this is cool. I'm going to start doing this. And at the time I was doing Islands on the Air too. And I was doing some SOTA also. So it kind of meshed into, all right, there's not a lot of islands, in the middle of the United States. There's some on the Mississippi, but not, there's only 2 or 3.
Those count, right?
Those count. Yep. They count. And there's not a lot of SOTA summits. There's some in southern Missouri, but it takes 2 hours to drive down there. I mean, it's a whole day of doing like a couple of SOTA summits. So all of these parks were close, right? They were within a 30-minute drive. And I'm like, this is awesome.
Kyle, just to interrupt for a second with a question. It sounds to me like Parks on the Air also kind of alerted you to the fact that there were parks you didn't know about. I mean, you could live in an area all your life and not realize that you're sitting in the middle of a lot of historical parks, places that you'd never have gotten to otherwise. And so what do you think that experience is about for you?
Yeah, that is a great observation. there are parks and trails and wildlife areas that I would never visit on my own. But now with Parks on the Air, I've visited. You read the plaques, you read the storyboards, you read all this history on why this entity is there, and it's fascinating. A perfect example is where the Missouri and the Mississippi River come together, the confluence of the two rivers. I probably would have never gone there. Living in St. Louis my whole life, I probably would have never gone there on my own. But I've been there a couple of times, and it's a great place to watch and see where these two rivers come together, and the history of Lewis and Clark on the camp that they put there, and all of the things that the history behind that point in Missouri. It's great. But yeah, you're right. There's dozens of parks that I discovered as Parks in the Air that had no idea. I know they existed, but I had no reason to go there.
I find, when people come to Israel, I live near Jerusalem, and I've lived here 23 years, and unless somebody comes here, there are things I've never seen. Apparently, I sit on top of a water tunnel that was used to supply water to the Temple Mount 2,000 years ago. People tell me it's an amazing tour. My house is literally on top of it for 23 years, and I've never been there. So it's kind of like I have a great appreciation for having this event like Parks on the Air that kind of informs you of things that you didn't even know about that are just around you within an hour of St. Louis, for example. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it's a great way to this Parks on the Air event has brought together so many people of now I know all of the activators that are in St. Louis and around St. Louis, and now we coordinate on occasion to go out to a park and meet each other and just activate the park. And there are some friends that I have met online that have literally flown to St. Louis just to activate the parks in St. Louis because, they're chasing parks. They're chasing new activations.
Right, and they learned about them from you, perhaps.
Perhaps, online we've got, a huge presence online with Discord and YouTube and social media. And, someone says in social media, oh, I'm going to be in St. Louis for a conference. Is there any there's any amateur radio activators or amateur radio operators that do Parks in the Air? I'll see that on social media or on that chat and say, yeah, sure. When you coming in? Oh, I fly in Tuesday and fly out Friday. Well, we'll do a park on Wednesday and Thursday. Meet me, and we'll coordinate, and I'll show them around the parks, and we'll try and coordinate as many parks during the week as possible. And it's great. It's a community.
Do you have a POTA rig? It sounds to me like you've done it enough that you probably even have a routine that allows you to get on a site, get it together really quickly, and you're on the air. What's the rig look like?
Yeah, the rig. So I just did a 10 park POTA rove with Sterling N0 SSC last weekend during Labor Day. And the rig looks like this. It's an 891, so it's 100 watts, and with a Bio-NO battery and 50 foot of coax. And I have a truck, so I have a trailer hitch mount. That's just a flagpole mount that I bought off of Amazon. And I bought a Pactena fiberglass pole that I extend up, all the way. It's about 30 feet. And we find a place to operate from. Sometimes it's a picnic bench. Sometimes it's the back of the truck. But I attach an end fed to the top of that pole and either run it down to like a driveway marker or an electric fence post. One of those electric fence posts that you can clip something onto, a wire onto. And I'd stick that in the ground, run the coax to it, get the 891 out, and I'm on the air. I can pull into a spot and be on the air in less than 5 minutes.
One of the provisos, though, is that you're going to these parks and you don't attach yourself to anything that's in the park, right? Because a lot of rangers and stuff will keep you from even tying onto a fence or tying onto a tree.
Right. Yeah. So in the national parks, sensitive national parks, you have to be very careful on how you set up. There's other places that are not that sensitive, like wildlife areas and conservation areas where, I don't feel bad throwing a line into a tree and, stringing an antenna for a temporary period of time or sticking a stake in the ground and using that as an anchor point. There's other places like national parks and other areas that I'm very sensitive to, and it's only freestanding antennas, something that you can put on a tripod or vertical that you can somehow, maybe lay into a tree. I've seen where people have taken a telescoping pole and just, laid it across the tree or into a tree, and that's their anchor point. So it's, easily removable. I just don't want to get into a situation where a ranger comes and says, hey, do you know that that's illegal what you're doing? If it's all freestanding, I can, make a case. It's easily defendable that, hey, this isn't like me driving my car or my truck into the parking lot. I'm not using any of the resources. I'm not binding myself to any of the resources of the park. I'm freestanding.
Does that mean that you're just as happy working in a parking lot in a park? You don't necessarily have to go into the sticks of the park in order to enjoy it.
Right. And that's the great thing about parks on the air is, the SOTA and the islands on the air, sometimes it takes a journey to get there. The great thing about parks on the air is the majority of the parks, you can drive to them and activate literally in your car, as long as you're in the bounds of the national park or the state park or the conservation area. Once you get into the bounds of that park or that area, you can activate. It doesn't matter if you hike 12 miles in or you activate from the parking lot. So it's if you like to get out and you have a method of putting an antenna on the air inside that park, you can become an activator.
Is the 891, is the whole kit, is it part of the truck, or do you have a Go kit, or how do you work that out?
Yep, I have a Go kit. Basically, it's a Home Depot bin. and I throw everything into the Home Depot bin, and then I put that in the back of the truck, and then whenever I get to a location, I'll scout it out and say, oh, whenever we did our 10 park rove, we made sure that we were, out of the way. We scouted out a parking lot position where there was not a lot of traffic. And because, we've got wires, we've got, coax in the ground, we've got an end fed that comes out. So you don't want to be in the thick of things. But again, you can just drive up, scout out a location, pull out your stuff, operate. A lot of people, if you take a look at YouTube, there's a lot of people that they activate from the back seat because they have a lot more room in the back seat or the passenger seat, right? And they'll pull their radio out, take their coax out the door or out the window, and that's how they operate. So it's what you want to make of it. It is a portable event. It's a portable event. It is a hiking event. I want to set in my car event. It's whatever event that you want it to be, you can make it that.
Well, now you've done this so much that probably what's in your bin is everything that you need. But do you stage at your house first just to make sure that you don't drive 100 miles and find that you left that adapter that you needed?
Yes. The answer is yes, Eric. But have I drove 100 miles and forgotten something? Yes. The answer is yes. and you know how frustrating that is? I mean, but I always bring two radios. So I always bring my 891 and my KX3, or I bring my KX3 and my mountain topper, or there's always two radios in my rig or in my pack. There is also at least a couple of antennas that I can use depending on, the situation. I recently got a Elecraft AX1 antenna, one of those, the antennas that just connect to the KX3.
Right, it's a telescoping antenna with a loading coil at the bottom.
Yeah, I recently got that at Dayton this year, and I have fallen in love with that antenna because I can literally put my KX3 on the bed of my truck, and I can sit there on the bed of my truck and call CQ on CW and work the world. Case in point, I just did an activation on Saturday, and on that AX1 antenna from the Arch Grounds, I contacted France, and I contacted Hawaii on 15 watts. So that antenna has proven itself in its weight in gold on that is the smallest footprint that you could probably possibly have to call CQ from a park and work the world. And it was all on 20 meters.
And help with the sunspot cycle as well, right?
It does.
It does help a little bit, yeah. A few years ago, it would have been poorer, perhaps.
Right. But, I mean, that AX1, I got the 40-meter extension. And, if push came to shove, I'd probably, call CQ on 40 meters to see if I could get somebody a little bit closer. But, the sunspot cycle has definitely helped with propagation and was a driving factor.
Have you tried magnetic loop antennas out there on Parks on the Air?
I have not. I do not own or have even operated into a mag loop, so I don't have any experience with that.
It's my understanding, because I listened to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, that you are a trivia buff, and so therefore you like to do trivia quizzes. Where do you do trivia quizzes, and how did you become the trivia quiz maven?
Well, I like to play trivia at the bar, so I think that's where it started from. I have a YouTube channel. If you just Google my call sign on YouTube, it will pop up. And my love of trivia morphed into or spilled over into ham radio. And I'm like, you know what? It would be great if I could host some type of live trivia, ham radio questions on my YouTube channel. So I searched and searched and searched and finally decided upon, I had no idea that there was a website or an application called Kahoot.it. And it's basically an application that teachers use to quiz their students. And it's a everyone in the classroom pulls their phones out because that's the world we live in. And the teacher shows a question and everyone plays on their connected devices. Well, I'm like, well, I could probably do that. I could show the question on YouTube and everyone playing at home can get their connected device out and play in real time. And the question gets displayed on their iPad, their phone, their computer, whatever they're playing on in real time. And, there's a small delay in YouTube world, but they see the question as soon as I hit the button to go to the next question. And then they answer the question and points are based on how fast you answer the question. And of course, a correct answer. So about once a month, I get together with my friends on YouTube and we make it a community event and we create 4 rounds of 10 questions of amateur radio stuff. And we play Kahoot. And there's 40, 50, 60 people that play, once a month. And we crown a winner at the end of a round. And it's all for bragging rights, right? It's just accolades.
So why couldn't you do that on radio? I mean, why couldn't you do that on like a All-Star net or a 2-meter net or an HF net? Have you thought about doing that?
I have. My club actually does that on a regular basis where they will do that on the repeater.
I hadn't thought about using Kahoot also with that.
Oh, yeah. That's a good idea.
You could actually score people at the same time, and then you're kind of merging the technologies.
That is a very good idea. Yeah, I never thought about that.
With an All-Star net or DMR or whatever, it seems to me that then you could also play worldwide.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. I never thought about that. I had just gravitated towards YouTube because Kahoot is a visual thing, right? But it could be an audio thing too, right? Where you're just hearing the question. But recently they just came out where the question is sent to your device and you can read the question and then answer it at the same time. Before, whenever I started this endeavor, it was as soon as the question popped up onto the screen, either you had to read it or I had to read it aloud, and then that's whenever the clock started to tick, for the time. But yeah, your point is very valid. You could totally do this over HF or over the repeater, and just say the question, and people could answer on their connected device at home. Totally valid.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. What is the most interesting thing that you find about amateur radio now?
The most interesting thing I find is remoting your station.
Really?
Yeah, I think this world that we live in with the internet and being able to remote your station to a location where you have a low noise floor, or you have a location that is better than what you currently have in your HOA or at your apartment or your house or whatnot. My station is 100% remote. I don't have a station here in the city of St. Louis anymore. I have gotten rid of my station, and my station is now at a contest station in the middle of Missouri, and we have 3 towers, and my station, my 6700, is at W0ECC, who is owned by Ward Silver, N0AX. And my station is there, and Ward and I share time where Ward gets priority because it's his station. I just provided the radio, but I gave Ward my Maestro, and I said, go to town. Let's remote all this stuff. So we've been in the process, and we're kind of done. We need to remote the amps, but we have remoted all the rotators. We have remoted all the antenna switches. We have gotten to the point where, it is all done online. I can turn the station on. I can turn the station off. And it has changed the way that I operate from a standpoint of I can hear stations. I can get on at any time and be able to do ham radio and work the world on beams and antennas that actually have some gain and be able to hear stations. It's great. It's one thing whenever you have an S9 noise floor and you can't hear anything on 40 meters after 5 p.m. It's another thing whenever you have an S3 of noise floor or S4 on 40 meters at 5 p.m. or at 8 p.m. and you can hear stations that are coming in from around the world. It's great.
So you could live in your micro house and
exactly
use your laptop as the interface, right?
Right. I mean, I have contested on this remote station. I have, I've got a couple of thousand POTA locations hunted on this remote station. Having a low noise floor has changed my perception of ham radio and all of the things that you can do with ham radio. Now the world is literally unlimited.
Yeah, I've heard about Ward's location as well. So it's quite a rural location. It's on a hill, I believe.
It's on a hill. And Eric, there's some places like, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I worked Tasmania on 10 meters. Rotated the antenna to Tasmania. My friend Hayden, VK7HH, was calling CQ, and I worked him. He was a 2.2, and I was about a 5.5 to him, but worked him on 10 meters, Tasmania, in the evening.
So the picture, just so that I understand, the picture on QRZ at the bottom of your QRZ page is this. There's a folding table that has a computer attached to the end of it, and you have this kind of rack. What is that picture? Is that your remote station with the flex radio at the bottom?
Yeah, let me get to, so that is the remote station. If you take a look at my QRZ page, that is the remote station. So starting at the top, there is a AC switch that basically turns the station on and off. So that's all of the AC control, and that is remote controllable. And by the way, I control all of this stuff with a program called Node-RED.
Okay, sure.
And Node-RED, if you don't know anything about Node-RED, Node-RED was created by IBM for the Internet of Things, for your refrigerator to talk to your washer, to talk to your doorbell, to all of these things. Well, the ham radio community has basically embraced Node-RED, and now we are controlling radios and devices that talk to our radios and antenna switches and amplifiers through Node-RED. And it's great. It's a great community. Go check it out if you're into remote radio.
So there's a Raspberry Pi at the top.
There's a Raspberry Pi at the top. That's what runs Node-RED. Then I've got this AC switch that has a bunch of wall warts plugged into it that have a bunch of T43 or T240 43 toroids. Actually, I think they're mixed 31, to tell you the truth. Mixed 31 toroids, so we don't get any RF into the shack, because whenever you put a shack at Ward Station, things have to be pretty tidy.
If you're watching on video, I've actually put the picture up on the screen here. So we have the Raspberry Pi. You've got a bunch of toroids that you're using to keep the signals off of the wires.
Right.
This is a AC control at the top there?
Yep. That's a digital loggers AC, so a switch. So there's 8 AC relays in this digital loggers, and then the 2 up at the top are always on. So I'm able to control this via Node-RED to switch off these AC outlets on and off. So one of them is my DC power supply, and then I just put the DC power supply switch in the on position, and this is how I turn it on and off remotely.
What's the box?
The box is a KM-Tronics relay, and it's got 8 normally open and normally closed relays, and it's plugged into Ethernet and runs off of 12 volts. That's how I turn my flex on and off. So whenever the relay closes, there's a connection in the back of the flux with an RCA cable, and it just closes the relay, and it tells the flex to turn on.
And you made a nice investment in backup power supplies at the bottom there?
Actually, there's no backup power supplies.
Those are batteries?
No, so the shelf there in the middle is the modem, the fiber modem, and then the second one down, that's the Flex 6700. Then the key to all of this station is a PC at the remote end. So a PC that you can remote control at the remote end is key, so you can do firmware updates, and doing digital modes at the remote end is a lot less intensive than bringing all of that audio back to your location, your QTH, and then sending that audio back through the internet to your remote. So if there's any digital, like I run FT8 on this, I run my RIDI contests on that, so everything stays local. I'm just sending screen pixels back to my QTH.
I see. So you're using like a remote software like TeamViewer or something like that, AnyDesk?
Yep. Actually, I use Chrome Remote Desktop.
Oh, okay.
Yep, it works great. And then at the very bottom is the Astron power supply.
So this is the PC on the shelf below. And what's this computer on the side that's mounted to the desk? That
is the Station A's computer for the contest station. So not part of my remote station.
I saw that on the QRZ page. I said, I have to ask you about that because that's very clever.
Yeah, as new radios come out and they put remote interfacing into these new radios, I mean, I think even if you don't even have to have a remote station, all you need to do is set up that station. Maybe you have a great station at your QTH and you want to get into it at different times whenever you're not in your QTH, right? You can set all this stuff up and remote into it, even, if it's at your house. You don't have to have a remote station.
Even mobile. You could run your QTH station from your mobile.
Yeah.
Over LTE or something like that.
Right. And as manufacturers start to think about how am I going to interface this radio into a remote station. Hopefully more manufacturers are thinking about this, but Flex is leading the way in that scenario.
What could we be doing better? You're heavy into ham radio media on YouTube. Obviously, you're out there actually operating. What could we do better to attract young people to the hobby? If we're going to replace the old priesthood of amateur radio, how do we do that? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think not forcing ham radio onto the younger kids is one of the aspects. Letting them, naturally progress into ham radio, but showing them, there's another thing that has a radio in it that is not your cell phone, that you can talk around the world. Like I said, you can tell whenever people are gravitated towards amateur radio and interested because they ask a bunch of questions and they ask, oh, that's really cool. What is that? What are these frequencies that you're talking on? What are these things that you're doing? Also, I think that using amateur radio in a competition scenario, I think is also fascinating with getting younger people. And whenever I say younger people, I really mean people under the age of 50, of getting the younger generation. I grew up, the internet, I remember getting my first email address whenever I was a sophomore in college, right? And never thinking, what is this email address? This is never going to take off, right? And here I am. I can't leave the house. I can't even go into the next room without my cell phone, right? But I'm always checking stuff on my cell phone. So I have this technology-driven focus that how do we incorporate technology and ham radio and competition into ham radio? How do we get contesting? I think contesting is one of the key aspects of getting a younger generation into ham radio. And people might, say, well, you got to get into it. No, it's in DXing, or it's in repeaters, or it's in digital modes, or it's in system fusion or DMR. I think to get people, doesn't matter how old you are.
We live almost to 100 years of age now, so 35 years old is kids.
Yes. I think driving competition and showing people that, there's contests out there, and how do we integrate YouTube, and how do we integrate social media, and how do we integrate the technology that we have into ham radio so it's fun, it's interesting. Case in point, I was at the Huntsville Ham Fest a couple weeks ago, and I was at a bar with a bunch of my ham radio friends, and Tetris, a competition, a head-to-head Tetris competition, was on the television. Everyone was fascinated by these two kids doing head-to-head Tetris competition. Now, what would happen if we did that with ham radio and contesting? We put two people head-to-head in a sprint, in a 5-minute sprint, and they had to contact as many contacts as possible. And we mapped out the contacts on the screen, and you got, maybe it was like a Stu Perry type of competition where you got points for the farthest QSOs that you made. And you made it a competition, a live competition, where you're pinning people against one another, or people in your same bracket, your same category. And we broadcast that to the world. If you go on Twitch and you see these gamers, there's kids, gamers that have 5 and 6 million subscribers, that there's other people that all they do is watch these people play video games. What would happen if one of these kids that had 5 million subscribers on Twitch, they got into ham radio and they started broadcasting their ham radio escapades on their Twitch channel?
I think it's a fascinating idea. I'd never heard of Twitch until just this moment. But it sounds to me like, why not?
Yeah.
With the technology now, if you use OBS or something like that, then you could have multiple feeds on your Twitch channel, right, as you're doing the contesting. You could make quite a production out of contest.
Oh, yeah. Just think of all of the people all of the eyeballs that you would hit if a big a big Twitch streamer got into ham radio and, made some overlays and made it interactive. Whenever you contacted Israel from Missouri, it would, say, oh, power up. And you would get, bonus points for contacting another country, another DX country.
You could do live scoreboards and things like that as well, right?
Exactly.
Are live scoreboards actually being used in any of the contests, the ham radio contests that are going on now?
So the CAC, the Contest Advisory Committee, is working on live scoring. And the problem that we have in contesting is after you compete in a contest, you have to wait weeks or months to see how you did. I want instant gratification. The minute that I stop that contest, I want to know if I won or where I was in the pack.
It seems to me that would be hard. I mean, nowadays, putting up a DigitalOcean server, and you could actually create your own contest and actually create your own scoreboard and rules and stuff like that.
So, Eric, you've nailed it. Where we have a part of the ham radio community that doesn't want to change, that they want to submit a Cabrillo file on email or paper.
So there's no reason that you couldn't start your own contest then, right?
Exactly. So you have nailed it. Why can't, weekends that have a huge contest going on, CQ Worldwide, or a weekend that a lot of stations are on air. I had this conversation with somebody who didn't want to change, and I said, you know what? You can have your contest. You can go ahead and call CQ as much as you want, but I'm going to make a QSO with you, but I'm going to create my own contest with my own rules and my own streaming. Literally, you get bonus points if you stream it. You can submit a log, but I'm going to make a contest logger that does real-time scoring, and maybe we send all the QSOs to the blockchain, and that's how we're verifying QSOs is in the blockchain, and they're being verified and they're being mined in real time. So the minute that contest is done, exactly all the QSOs are verified. Within the second what your score is and how you did among your peers.
Right, but it also puts a fire under your butt over the weekend if you're looking at a real-life scoreboard and saying, I could do better, I could spend more time here.
And there is a real-time scoreboard that if you go to online scoreboard, contestonlinescoreboard.com, there is a real-time scoreboard, but the problem is those scores, not everyone sends the data to, and two, they're not verified. So you need some type of verification, and then you also need everyone to participate. So in this new contest, you say, hey, you have to send your score, you have to be on the blockchain, and you have to send your score to a central server where we're validating your QSOs, and we're validating, or things are happening in real time, and unless you send all of that information to that central repository or that blockchain, you're not in the contest.
With software-defined radio and digital modes, including CW as a digital mode, it seems to me that you could have a lot of third-party listening that's doing this verification.
Yeah.
We're at a point in the state of the art where we could actually have everything but the voice modes, I think. You could actually have this verification. You don't need somebody to take all your QSL cards and count them by hand.
Yeah.
Although maybe nobody's doing that anymore.
We need to get to a point where we're advancing ham radio and using the technology that is in the palm of our hand in the cell phone.
You've got my brain going. Even if you're using the same contest logger or that logger is connected to the central server, it seems to me that if all of a sudden you see the same QSO coming up on two places, then you've actually verified, meaning that you could have somebody making up their log, But if all the logs are interconnected, then it seems to me that you'd have this verification. This sounds easy to do now. And with Starlink flying over every place, you could be anywhere pretty much to do this.
Right. The problem that I have seen is getting people motivated that are smarter than me to actually program some of this stuff. And it's going to be the younger generation to do this. It's just a matter of we need to get the right ideas in front of the right people that know how to implement this and start the process.
What's interesting is I'm touting the Academy. If you come to the QSO Today Academy, you're going to see that there are people that they haven't been in ham radio very long. I think it's the guy that made JSA Call, right?
Yeah, Jason.
He's there for a week or something like that, and he says, there's a better way to do this, and all of a sudden he's writing code. So I think you're right. It's people that come in and they don't have this preconceived notion about the way it's supposed to be, and all of a sudden they say, well, we can figure this out. It shouldn't take very long. I was telling people I'm writing code. I'm writing HTML code on the QSO Today Academy presentation page where it's got countdown timers. I don't write code. I used OpenAI to write the code, and having this dialogue with it for 40 minutes, we fixed it. So I'm saying that it doesn't seem to me right now that you have to be a rocket scientist to be able to create a contest that has a real-life scoreboard, maybe add Kahoots to it. It doesn't matter what it is.
That's a good idea.
You could end up creating a really fun sprint or weekend or something like that, and you don't need a bunch of old people to tell you can't do it.
Yeah. There's also an idea that I had where, let's say you're contesting and there is some type of rule that says if you make, 30 QSOs in 15 minutes, then your power up is you get access to a superstation with, 5 over 5 over 5 for the next 15 minutes. So you switch over to the superstation and you're just, rolling in QSOs during the contest. And then, your time is done. And then the next person who just got, X amount of QSOs in X amount of time gets access to that station.
Okay, so dear listeners, you're listening to Kyle come up with we're documenting these ideas right now. Because it seems to me, what a great idea. And it could be something as simple as that. And you're using Node-RED.
Yeah, can use Node-RED for it, yeah.
Interface Node-RED to the big server. Or actually, because we're in a universe that federated is better, right?
Yep.
Like Mastodon, and the one that you cited, Discourse is also federated, perhaps?
No, I don't think so.
Central server.
Yeah.
I sent George a message last night. I said, by the way, All-Star is federated.
Yep.
So there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, and so I'm just reminding you, Kyle, that you've said it here on QSO Today, and so now we actually have a record of these ideas that we're banding back and forth. So if you forget when you go back to work today, you can always come back to the podcast to hear, what was that idea we were talking about? That sounds like that would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, there's a whole myriad of things that you can do now that we have the technology. We just need to implement them. The streaming online, the real-time scoring, the power-up stations, the new rules, that we can, the head-to-head competition. I would love to, and I'm kind of working this on the background, I would love to put together like the Tetris idea where 2 CW operators go at it and we give them, the best out of 2 out of 3 rounds, and it's 2 CW operators operating, trying to make as many call sign, decoding call signs, and the last man or the person that has the biggest score wins, right? And not only is there, and we stream this on YouTube, not only is there a competition perspective, but there's a spectator position too, where you have to make it interesting for the spectator. Just like in contesting, you roll into a Twitch stream and you see a bunch of people calling CQ or making contacts all over the world. Your 14-year-old kid is not going to know what's going on.
What if you allowed the spectator to control the next QSO? Meaning that the CW operator is operating, but the kid's looking at your spectral display and he's deciding what the next guy you're going to pounce on is.
That would be amazing. Yes. You and I are on the same level.
I have a feeling that I'm not on the same level, that there's a lot I could learn, but this has been fascinating for me. Do you have advice that you'd give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
New hams, especially if you're younger, get on YouTube, get on Discord, become a part of a community, right? If there is a community out there for you, I guarantee it. Discord is relatively new. YouTube's been around for a while, but some of the bigger bigger YouTube, Ham Radio Crash Course, Ham Radio 2.0, Toads, the Coffee and Ham Radio guys, Clubhouse, Ham Radio Clubhouse, Ham Radio Adventure Guy. All of those are not only YouTube channels, but they have Discords, and people hang out. There's thousands of people, like-minded people, that hang out on Discord, and we talk about ham radio all day and all night. And that community has solidified my interest in ham radio. Like, now, ham radio, not only was it a part of my life before, from a contesting perspective, POTA perspective, now I am on Discord and YouTube watching ham radio videos, talking about ham radios hours of a day. And I have learned so much information. Like, you go on there and there's a forum just for antennas. There's a chat for just antennas. And somebody new will come in and say, I don't understand how an end-fed works. And we will have a 50-minute, hour discussion about how an end-fed works over Discord. And then, somebody will say, hey, here's 3 or 4 end-feds that, if you're into kits, here's 3 or 4 end-feds that you can buy as a kit. Or if you want them, pre-made, here's some, and here's how you deploy it. It is a whole community of ham radio people talking about ham radio.
You just gave me an idea that I figure out how to connect Mastodon to the Academy.
Yeah.
I bet there's now APIs for everything.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you can connect all that stuff.
This is a fascinating conversation. Kyle, I've had so much fun, and I'm watching the clock because I know you have to go to work.
I have to go to work. Unfortunately, I have to go to work, and I can't do ham radio 10 hours, 12 hours a day. I would like to, but...
But your doctor tells you have to eat.
Oh, eating is overrated. Ham radio is life.
I've had such a good time talking to you, Kyle.
It's been great to be here, Eric.
And I appreciate so much that you came on today. And I hope to work you on the air, Kyle, but I also hope to talk to you on Discord or Mastodon or whatever it is we end up finding is the common channel. Thank you so much. And with that, I want to wish you 73.
73, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Kyle. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in AA0Z in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.